The Experience of Thinking. A series of talks on change of consciousness in the writings of European philosophers by John Thompson. Episode 7. Immanuel Kant.
Today we're talking about Immanuel Kant, and he's written a lot. And the library is written on what he's written, even on sections of books that he's written. So I think all we can do today is keep to our theme, try to give an example of what's this experience of thinking, and in some little way uncover how did this man operate in that field, just a little. He's a very complex and intricate thinker, and we'll have to approach him with caution. Before we do that, I'd just like to go back a little over what we were talking about last time. We're in the 18th century. Now, the 18th century has been called the age of the enlightenment. They were enlightened. I don't know if our century could ever be called the age of enlightenment. But they call themselves the age of enlightenment. At least that's the English translation of it. And it's impossible to summarize it, but certain things seem to stand out in that period. Look at the art and the writing and so on. It was the age of reason. Reason was a dominant theme. The world could be understood through reason. And consequently, we must get rid of all those superstitions that belong to the old way of looking at the world. Religion especially is full of it, according to these 18th century thinkers. And also the old hierarchies, which were based in simple traditions. These were no longer in the province of reason, and we should disband all these. It's also an age connected with that where everything comes under criticism. How society works, who rules society, how society is served, and all these questions. Even at the end of it, the role of women in society, this becomes a critical element. So this critical spirit is very strong in the 18th century. And underlying it all is the work of the great Isaac Newton, who lived into the first part of the 18th century, but his kind of scientific world he opened up, where everything can now be understood in terms of basic principles of science. This also underlies a lot of the thinking. Of course, there were opponents of the Newtonian picture, but very much it dominated the thinking of many people in that century. And connected with that, although not connected with Newton, connected with that whole attitude was what someone called, Schiller, I think, the disenchantment of nature. That is, nature, which had hitherto been seen in a kind of symbolic world. Everything was meaningful. When you spoke of a lion, you weren't speaking of a species, you were speaking of a force, an energy, some kind of picture of some elemental quality. And the whole of nature was seen in that dimension. It has symbolic qualities. Now with the 18th century, with these botanists and so on, everything belongs to a genus or a species. And so the lion is connected with the tiger and connected with other creatures, so on, because it's all part of the cat family. So that's a whole shift in thinking. That's one way of trying to give a picture of the 18th century. But there are other ways as well, of course. Now, the last talk we gave was about these three British empiricists. I call them British because, one was English, one was Scots, and the other was Irish. Anglo-Irish. That was Locke, Berkeley, and Hume. And they had a special orientation, which was quite different from their predecessors. And that's why they're called the empiricists. Now, empiricists mean that you start from your experience of life. All knowledge starts with experience. I open my eyes, I have experience. That's where I begin to understand the world. The world pours in, and I do something with it, and that's what we call understanding. But it's essentially my being in the world, experiencing it, the foundation, my knowledge. And all of them start in that base, Locke, Berkeley and Hume. But they all come to different pictures. I won't repeat all that again, but the Hume, the one who succeeds the other two, becomes very skeptical about any kind of speculative knowledge. That basically we are prisoners of our senses, that the world makes impressions on us, and that these impressions, when they're repeated again and again, become what we call ideas. But ideas are just confirmed impressions. And then the mind, or whatever you like to call it, has some kind of capacity to associate different experiences. For example, I think of how the chairs and tables and things, I can associate them and call them furniture. That's a kind of associative process because they belong, as Hume called it, they're contiguous, they're fit together. So I've got concepts like furniture, a house is walls and windows and so on. So that's how Hume thought we built up our understanding of the world, through association. And there were three basic processes of association. One he called resemblance. So when I think of red, I immediately can start thinking of other colors like blue and green because of association. So my mind works like that. That's just a fact of nature. And then I mentioned the other one, which he called contiguity, associated by being connected in some obvious way like furniture. And then there's a third one, which he said was the most dominant one, and that is cause and effect. Immediately we see something happens and we say, what's the cause? And we look for the cause. And so then we associate an event which happens with something that's happened before, and we connect them. So that's a connecting process. But he then denies that there's any kind of what you might call mental or transcendental connection between it. It's just we're observing things, so that if I see that when the sun comes out, the pavement gets warm, I just connect these two events, the sun shining, the pavement's getting warm, so I say the sun warms the pavement. But that's simply a connection of two quite independent events because they succeed each other, and we see that often enough to make that a law. The sun warms the pavement. So Hume ended up with this very skeptical attitude to human knowledge, and also skeptical to anything that was outside the realm of sense experience, like soul, self, liberty, freedom. All these things were perhaps habits of the mind, as he would call it, but they were not fundamental things that one could examine in terms of knowledge. He was an atheist, and he had to be very careful at that time not to expose his atheism, which was a rather unpopular attitude to have. These are the empiricists. Now, over against the empiricists, we had in Descartes and Spinoza philosophers who are called rationalists. That is, they put reason or the mind as the origin of our understanding of the world. It's a moment while, I think, to try and inwardly relate to these two different opposing attitudes. You remember Descartes was sitting in this Dutch inn with his dressing gown beside the stove, and he decides to examine himself and find out what is it that I can really have confidence in, that I know. Stove, Dutch inn, all that might just be an imagination. I might be dreaming it. How do I know I'm not dreaming it all? And he said, there's one thing I can be certain of, that I'm thinking. And even if I doubt I'm thinking, I'm still doubting is a thinking. So there's my cause. Now I've got it. That's my ground. That's what I stand on. I stand on the reality of the mind. Everything else can be a dream, but not this. I can't dream that I'm thinking. So that's where he stands. Spinoza says the most fundamental experience for him is a mind experience, the existence of God. And everything is worked out like a mathematical proposition from that fundamental concept of God, which was also nature for him. It wasn't some remote God, it was a nature that surrounds him, which is also the deity, which is I'm standing in, of which I'm part of. That is where I stand. But it's out of the experience of mind. And now these British empiricists didn't start from there at all. And you can see that there's a whole different orientation if you say that, look, I've got to, what is this? What is this? I've got to look at it, I've got to test it, I've got to put it to certain measurements and weigh it, and then I said, now I know what that is, that's a cake. And that's everything in experience is like that. I have to approach it in that way with my senses, and then something comes in, as Locke says, migrates into the soul, and now I know it. I know what it is. My senses have told me, and I'm going to base my knowledge on that experience. So rationalism and empiricism are like two ends of a pole. People looking at the world out of two totally different antagonistic points of view. The rationalists, the empiricists. And the empiricists are very much an Anglo-Saxon phenomenon. Very much. And I wouldn't say rationalism is just a continental one, but it's interesting that Descartes was educated by the Jesuits, and Spinoza had the background of the Talmudic schools. And they, of course, were still able to live in this reality of the mind. And for a human, mind is simply sense habits living in me. What's a lion? Oh, I've seen that one, so one in the zoo and so on. Well, they're lions. Lions. Habits of mind. So the actual, what Descartes sitting on in his chair by the stove is trying to bring alive in himself is this mind activity. And Hume is he's a very sharp man. Kant calls him that acute man. He thought Kant had the greatest appreciation of Hume's thinking. But he didn't just stop there. His thinking was subsidiary to experience. Now, in the general picture, if we look at how these two contrasting attitudes arise, go back right back to the Greeks, to Plato. For example, we spoke about how the two worlds, experience of the cave, everybody in the cave are looking at the world of phenomena, things as they appear to the senses, the real world, turn around and look at the real world. That's the real world of ideas, of archetypal forms. That's Plato. Two distinct worlds. And the real world for the philosopher is the world of the archetypal forms, the world of ideas. This world is a transitory world, but the reality of existence is only appreciated when you turn away from it and experience the world of the archetypes. Aristotle already makes a shift, but for him also thinking is based on a central understanding of the idea world, but the idea for Aristotle is embodied in the phenomena. In the plant, you can find the idea. It's not separate. In the human being, you find the idea of the human. It's not a separate entity. And then when you come through all through the Middle Ages, that reality of the idea persists to Aquinas and so on. And with the time of Aquinas, then there's a shift. And then we had William of Ockham, I told you about, who now said, ideas are just labels. You've just labeled it a lion. It could be called anything. It's just you look at a phenomenon and say, oh, I'll call that a lion. Lion, or the lion concept, is no longer living in the word. The word has emptied itself of that inner meaning. So for the medievals, lion meant lion. People put it on their shields, and it was like, family arms, because lion or tiger or whatever, because these were meaningful. They weren't just labels. You see a transition. The idea separate from the phenomena, the idea in the phenomena, and now the idea becomes simply a world that human beings produce. You've got the real world, and human beings just produce ideas. They're not ideas that are inherent in the world around us. And that's the world of not only the 18th century, but the world of our century. Ideas are human products and not inherent in the world we experience. It becomes the question, then out of that different orientation, that different positioning of the human being, then you ask the question, how do I know the world? You're bound to get different answers. You're standing in a very different place than Plato or Aristotle and so on. When we ask that question, how do I know the world? Now, Mr. Kant lives through the 18th century, dies in 1804, 1724 to 1804. That's a good old age. He's born in Königsberg. Now, if you look on the map, you can't find Königsberg anywhere. It's called Kaliningrad in Russia. But in those days, in the 18th century, it was part of Prussia. There was a medieval band of knights who carried the Prussian country right into Russia, to Lithuania today. And there, Kant was born. He lived there his whole 80 years. He was born there. He died there. There's a monument for him still in Kaliningrad. He studied his university there. He was a professor at the university there. He never moved more than about 30 or 40 miles from Königsberg during his whole life. At the end of his life, he was seen as the supreme thinker of the 18th century. Goethe had immense respect for Kant, Schiller, many of the great figures of literature and philosophy looked up to Kant. Kant had opened the world. Our English Coleridge had great respect for Immanuel Kant. And indeed, right through the 19th century, the thinking of Kant dominated. And it's amazing that the thinking, which is so complex and so detailed and so intricate, should have such a powerful influence on a whole of society. Not that everybody had read Kant's works by any means. Probably only a few people ever read them. But the interesting thing is that somehow the whole of society becomes imbued with a certain kind of thinking, which is Kantian. I'm going to try and explain, if I can, a little what this Kantian is, this Kantian thinking. His first great book that he published, Critique of Pure Thinking. He was nearly 60 when he got down to writing this, and it took him 10 years to do it. When he published it, he realized that hardly anybody understood it. So he wrote another book, shorter version, called the Prolegomena, which means a kind of introductory essay. It's about 180 pages, but it's an introductory essay to the critique. And in this one, he explains how, reading David Hume, he was aroused from his dogmatic slumber. And that set him off. And I'm going to try and explain what a dogmatic slumber looks like. In general, apart from these British empiricists, the philosophy was dominated by what you might call a metaphysical approach. Now, the metaphysical approach, meta means beyond, physics means nature in original Greek, beyond the natural phenomenon. It became to mean in Europe beyond the phenomena of the senses. There's another world, the meta world. And that's the meta world of God, of ideas of freedom, of angels, whatever. So that Aquinas and all these people were, not entirely, of course, but they had a significant metaphysical world that they described. But that wasn't a world that they encountered through the senses. So it's coming from somewhere else. Where's it coming from? So these philosophers like Leibniz and no doubt Descartes and Spinoza and others that Kant had reading had also made him a metaphysician. He was speculating about these worlds that I've just described, which are not part of our sense world. And then he read the skeptic David Hume and read what Hume said about causality. And as I've just explained, Hume interpreted causality as just a habit of repeated encounters with a certain event. The sun warming the pavement. Well, I've seen that before. Oh, the sun must be warming that. I'm putting it rather simply. But out of this associative possibility that goes on in the human being, we come to these so-called laws. But Hume was very contemptuous of people who thought they had some spiritual significance, this spiritual mind significance. Of course, Hume understood there was a mind, but what he rejected is that this mind had a special kind of autonomy of its own, which in it dictated how we grasp the world. The world just comes to us, that's it. And Kant read this. And he says, that acute man, David Hume, wakened me from my dogmatic slumber. And he says, what is he saying? If Hume is rejecting, seeing causality as this, and other people say it's in another place, not just impressions that we've had, then what is it? Because if it's a purely mental capacity, then that could mean that when we look at the world, it's not just the world telling us about it, it's we're looking at it through a particular structure of the mind, which has causality in it. And so as I look at the world, it's not just the world's naively presenting itself in all its truth. I'm actually bringing something of my mental construction to the grasping of that world. And that's what I'm going to explore. Now, a little explanation in order to get there. When we make statements about the world, the sun is shining, there are trees in the garden, all these are statements. And they are of different kinds, first of all. And these different kinds of statements I want to explain. So some kind of statements are called a priori, and another kind of statements are called a posteriori. These two words means before, and that means after. Any statement which I make, which depends on my experience of the world, I can only make it after that, is a posteriori. Any statement I make, which I don't need to have any experience of the world, is priori. I'll give you an example. My dog likes bones. All right? Subject, my dog. And what they call the predicate, that's the whole rest of the sentence, likes bones. That's clearly, I've got to experience that in order to say that. I have to know the dog. I have to have looked at whether it really likes bones before I can say it. But a dog is an animal. Well, I don't have to go looking around all the dogs to see if they're animals to prove that they're animals. I simply know that animal is part of the definition of a dog. So animal is contained in my concept of dog. So it's a priori. I don't need to experience it. And so many general statements and definitions are like that. 5 plus 3 equals 8. Now, do I need to experience the world in order to come to that conclusion? Do I have to have 5 things and 3 things and to prove 8 equals 8? I have to have the sense experience to establish that as a valid sentence. 5 plus 3 equals 8. Think about it. A equals B, B equals C, therefore A equals C. Do I need to experience the world to make that statement? Or is it purely something that I can establish in my mind? Okay? The 3 angles of a triangle equals 2 right angles. In order to establish that, do I run around the world measuring triangles to prove it, or is it purely a priori? Now, most of the statements that we make are a posteriori. I saw my friend in the village. I, subject, saw my friend in the village. I might be telling a lie. Prove it. Okay, I can prove it. So that's a valid a posteriori statement. So most statements are like that. Now, there's another division, which Kant pointed out, is an analysis, analytical, and the others are synthetical. And these initially look rather similar, but they're not. This has got to do with whether, as Kant called them judgments instead of statements, whether a judgment is dependent on experience or not. I don't mean mental experience, of course. You could say working out a geometry exercise is a mental experience, but I mean experience of the world. That's the difference. Now, there's another distinction about propositions or statements or judgments, and that is some contain themselves, like a definition. A town is a large conurbation of people. I'm not saying anything that I derive from the sensual. I'm explaining town. And so when you're explaining that in the concept town is that other predicate, what they call the predicate. So that's analytical. I'm simply analyzing a concept. But when I come to a synthetical one, then I've got two quite different concepts that I bring together, that I connect. St. Petersburg was the capital of Russia. Now I've got the concept Petersburg, the capital of Russia. These two I needn't necessarily bring together, there's no necessity in it, but my knowledge of the experience of the world, even though it's not direct, it brings them together as Petersburg was the capital of Russia. And so all our statements like that, most of them are of a synthetical nature. When we come to definitions and mathematics and some science, we're in the analytical sphere. If you try to put these two together, analytical, that means it contains the predicate, it contains what it's saying. Like a dog is an animal. You can see that's an analytical a priori statement. Now, it's not possible to get an analytical a posteriori, because then you would be referring to something in experience and bringing them together so that all analytical statements are made, that doesn't exist, all analytical statements are really a priori. Now, when we come to synthetical ones, then a synthetical from Kant a posteriori is simply two things that I bring together, two concepts that I connect through experience. I ate porridge for breakfast this morning. I, subject, porridge for breakfast, ate porridge for breakfast. My wife can verify it. That's two things I bring together. Synthetical, a posteriori, that means two different things I connect through experience of the world. And now, Kant's big problem is, can you have this? Can you create two mental concepts, bring them together without having external sensory experience to justify it? For example, God is omniscient. I've got to look for God and look for omniscience to justify bringing them together. Or can I say that? Or is that simply an analytical statement in which I'm actually, if I said my friend knows a lot, that's clearly synthetic a posteriori. I'll show you my friend. I'll prove it. But I have to have the experience of it. When I say God is omniscient, what am I actually saying? And that goes into the realm of what Kant and everybody else would call a metaphysical statement. Can you make any truly metaphysical statements that make sense in the world? And Kant spent 10 years digging into that question. Are there synthetical a priori judgments? 500 pages. Then an explanatory book for the dummies. And so this is what I want to open up for you, okay? Now, Hume, woken from his dogmatic slumber, and saying, so Hume's saying there are no synthetical a priori statements. Everything is experience. You're just experiencing. You see the pavement a number of times, the sun warms the pavement. All a posteriori. And Kant then says, I'm going to show that there are synthetical a priori statements. And that's what the book's about. So he says this. When we look at the world, the mind is already constructed. It's constructed in a certain way. That any event, I'm immediately asking, what's the cause? I'm going through the wood and a branch falls down. Immediately I say, why does that happen? Is there somebody sawing it up there? Is it a rotten branch? Is a baboon sitting on it and it's too heavy? I don't know. What is it? I look for the answer. So that's just what we do everywhere. That as soon as we encounter an event, we look for causes. That may often be obvious, and obvious they are. But there are many events, of course, which we ask for an explanation. And that is just how we are constructed. That we are constructed as beings to look for cause-effect. It's not there, then the world's just doing what it's doing. But I'm so made that whatever I see, I'll tell you a story. I have a very complicated heating system with solar panels and so on. The sun stopped working. No hot water from the taps, no shower. Maybe all the experts come, and the guy finally says, I'll come, and it was a month later, no hot water. And I said, of course, I, the plumber, everybody else thought there must be a cause. There must be. Wasn't you agree? There must be a cause. Well, and finally on the 5th of January, I bring up the guy, I say, you said you were coming, could you come? 2 hours later, I was doing the washing up, and the hot water came back. Just as it was before. So now, you see, Kant's wrong. There can be events without causes. Nothing causes it to stop. Nothing causes it to start again. It's a causeless event. So, to go back to Kant, Kant says, okay, this is one of the transcendental elements. That means belonging to the mind, not belonging to the experience, which human beings have, which shape the way we grasp the world. There are others. Our experience of space and time is of a similar nature. We don't actually have space as an object out there. Is space infinite? Is it finite? How do we know? We can't just look at it and decide. Space is a construct of the mind. Time is also a construct of the mind. We experience things in succession because of our mental construction. Consequently, we're getting to the point that what we thought, what these empiricists thought, naively, was that you just open your eyes and the world migrates in. It's not like that at all. We are actually shaping it. Well, I look out at the world and I put you in relationship to myself, in relationship to others, everything I put into that space. But that space is already something I bring to the experience. That experience of space is a transcendental one, not a phenomenal one. Now, there are others. 12 categories. They're called the categories, and we found 12. And I'll just give you 3. One of them is cause and effect. He calls them analogies of experience. And there are 3 of them. One of them is cause and effect. That is part of the construct of the mind. Now we said, now if I look up there, I look out through that window, and I see trees and the path and the ground and so on, and I look out through that window, and I have no difficulty if I didn't assume that that was the same ground that was going round there, but I've got a totally different image here from there. I could think, oh, that's such an interesting image. Oh, that's got nothing to do with it. But of course I don't. You think I was crazy if I didn't say that's the substance of that image is the same substance as out there. They're part of a totality. I don't have to think it, it just is. That is a mind construction. It's not what the experience of the senses is telling me. I've already got that built into my mental approach to the world, which identifies substance not as a material, not as earth or stones or trees, but just as a continuity. I don't know what to call it. Remember, Berkeley was thinking, Locke thought that matter, an invisible matter, drew everything together. Berkeley thought it was the mind that drew everything together, God. And Hume dismissed them all. And now Kant is saying there's a transcendental concept, which is not the same as a sense concept in the Humean sense, which binds experiences together. And I call it substance. Cause and effect, substance. And the third one, again, it's so obvious. I look at that tree out there, and there's a shadow moving on it. And the shadow's moving on the leaves, and the leaves are moving. And just in that, I immediately have an experience of a whole collectivity of coming togetherness. Sun, wind, bark, leaf, and it's all, and I don't have to say, how does the leaf belong to the tree? This experience that there's a whole coexistence into which I pick out my sensory area, but aware out of myself that there is a coexistence. Now, Kant is saying this experience is not given by looking at the world. You bring that coexistence to the world. You bring the experience of substance to the world. You bring the experience of space, time, causality, and so on to the world. These are part of the transcendental world of the human. You call it transcendental, not the same as Emerson's transcendental, by the way. You call it the transcendental experience of the world. And so he felt that he was actually bringing together the experience of rationalists and the experience of the empiricists. He's empiricist, and he says all knowledge is based on experience of the world. That's true. But the rationalists are right that mind plays its role, and that we experience the world through the lens of the mind, which is constructed in a particular way. By whom? We're just examining how it's constructed. And that takes us into these transcendental concepts of causality, substance, and so on. So that gives you some kind of flavor, I hope, of where Kant is moving and trying to bring into thought forms this experience that these empiricists didn't have it right. A naive assumption that you open your eyes and the world tells you who it is. It's obviously false, because if it were like that, I wouldn't need to ask questions about the world. But all the time I'm asking questions about the world, so that there's a big gap between my experience of the world and my knowledge of the world. That's one important thing. And now Kant has another step to make, and that's a tricky one. You risk falling into the trap that basically this world that we're looking at is essentially a mind construct. Causality, substance, and the whole 9 others, so I'm not going to go into, are all, example, formed in us so that we grasp the world as we grasp it. That doesn't mean to say that's what the world is, does it? It's how we grasp the world. So maybe the world as it is different. I can't guarantee that, because I'm only seeing it through my particular spectacles of categories, space, time, and so on. Somebody else with different spectacles might say, oh, no, that's not the world, it's different. So, but he says it's not just phenomena I'm talking about, like Hume. Behind all that, there is a real world, but we can never know it. And that's the famous thing in itself. Behind the whole world of the phenomena, there is a real world and things in themselves. So when I look at the lion, the lion, it appears to me, seen through my spectacles, but what is the lion in itself? I can never know that. And so he sees his task roughly to say, I want to map out the boundaries of what we can really know. That's a real deed. Tell humanity what you can really know and what you can't know. And then a large part of his writing goes on the exploration of the metaphysical. He doesn't dismiss it. He doesn't say it's all nonsense. He examines the metaphysical world, which he'd originally been asleep in, and now he'd woken up to grasp what is the connection between mind and sense world. And now he'd come to this other world, behind it, the world of things in themselves, that we can never know. He nevertheless explores it. And he does it in such a way that he, for example, one of his categories that I spoke about is that when we look at the world, we have a unity of experience, a unity of apperception, as he calls it. Everything is connected. We don't say, oh, why are the clouds down there? Why is there a cloud down there? Everything is connected. That's how we see the world, always connected. And meaning was a very important concept for Kant. So everything is connected in the way that even if I don't fully understand it, I know it's connected. I know it's meaningful. I don't say it's absolutely meaningless that there are trees there. I can't say that. It's stupid. Categories are a lot to do with saying stupid things if you're not aware of the category. But he said, unity of apperception doesn't necessarily prove that there's a single self are perceiving. That's metaphysical. And so he demolishes all the great medieval proofs of the existence of God and shows that none of them can stand up. He takes questions of freedom and determinism. The world is just a determined chain of events, one cause causing another. And he denies that can be established. So this whole metaphysical world, he comes to conclude that that's beyond the boundaries of knowing. But don't dismiss it. Believe it. Believe it. Because it's essential. And he gives, I can't fully understand this, he seems to indicate that the way he's thinking establishes in some way the reality of a metaphysical world, but not in the way that we've been talking about the reality of the sense world, that it's something real, but we can't know it. Believe in God. He doesn't say don't believe in God. Believe in God, but we can't prove it. You can equally prove there's no God or there is a God. These are called antinomies, opposites. You can always prove that we're free or we're not free. You can always prove that there's a soul or there's not a soul. These are beyond true knowing. But hold to the idea of soul and self and God. As if this incredible integrity of his thinking leads him to certain conclusions, but another part of his being is refusing to let go of a substantial area which we call morality and right action. Although he does write another critique, a few years later, so getting on to 70 now, critique of practical reason. And the critique of practical reason is basically all about freedom and morality. Again, he starts off with ideas of the mind that exist, not coming out of the sense experience, in order to find right action. And I'll say just a word about this, his morality. Again, he has the same structure of a sense world and a mind world and how they interrelate. And in the world of morality, first of all, he accepts many of the common moral attitudes. Don't murder, don't tell lies, etc., etc. He accepts all that. But he says, what's the ground for all that? And he gives this ground, which he calls duty, reverence for duty. And that's the basis of his morality, reverence for duty. He said only two things inspire genuine awe. The starry sky above, which we hardly ever see, and the moral law within. These for him were the two things that inspired awe. The starry world above and the moral law within. And he based the morality on the goodwill. It's a goodwill. And out of this goodwill, in its reverence for duty, you come to realize that morality has to be universal. You can't have individual, personal, moral schemes. So every action which you do to be good must be according to the maxim that if you do it, you can universalize it. If I tell a lie, and I universalize that so that everyone tells lies, the whole of society falls apart. And such things. And he spends a lot of time analyzing traditional concepts of morality in terms of what he eventually calls the categorical imperative. And this categorical imperative is that which enables us to overcome our self-interest. Our action is generally governed by self-interest. But obedience to the categorical imperative that whatever you do, you can universalize it. It can be the maxim for anybody else, not just you. Then that is a true morality. He also this is his definition of the categorical imperative. Act in such a way that you treat, no, this is not the categorical imperative, but another statement connected with it. Act in such a way that you treat humanity, whether in your own person or in the person of another, always at the same time as an end and never simply as a means. So that's Kant. This personality living all that time in Königsberg. He made a regular walk across the park, whatever it was, in the middle of Königsberg. And I don't know if people had their watches then, some of them may have had, but they could set their watch by the time. It was absolutely irregular. So it's a man who's living with that huge head. He was a small person too. And sitting there at his desk all these years, studying, is there a synthetical a priori judgment?
The next episode is on Hegel.